Hi everyone, I hope you're doing well. This is going to be the first lecture of art history, and it's going to be a really stunted one because this is not an art history class, but we want you to understand the movements and things like that. So, we'll spend a couple weeks on this summer, but if you're really interested in it, you should definitely take some art history classes because you get more information. So art history, or not art history, art has been around basically for as long as humans have been around. People have been making things, drawing things, dancing, singing since the beginning of time that we know of. And so, there's a lot of stuff to look at, and different regions interpret it in different ways. But also, we all kind of evolved at the same time as well. So, and adapted to living conditions and things like that. So, what we're going to do though is start out with the Greeks, because before that, the Greeks kind of were the first to really utilize creative ways of portraying people and subjects. Okay, so and the an early period is the classical period, and during this time, this is when the Olympics were invented and things like that, and there was a lot of really grand, beautiful architectural buildings created. This is the Parthenon, which would have housed a very large goddess in here. The Greeks are known for the columns that they designed and architectural, advances at a time, that was making great, great strides. They portrayed men as ideal, meaning, extremely fit and young and strong. This is a very famous sculpture called the discus thrower, right? So it's an Olympic sport, it's of the time. And you can see the strain of his muscles and the strength in his body, but look at his face. It's very non-emotional, right? If you're really going to get up and throw a discus as far as you can, there's going to be a intense, expression on your face. So the fact that this does not have one, is showing the human as ideal, almost not quite godlike, but just, superhuman, idealized, no problems there. During the classical time period too, a couple things were discovered and given terms, and one of them is contrapposto. Contrapposto is the putting all your weight onto one foot, one leg. And then what happens is your other leg kind of relaxes, and so your hip line is no longer parallel to the ground. It's kind of tilted. And it just basically gives a little bit more beautiful way of portraying people. It looks as if there's more motion going on, and it's just aesthetically pleasing. It's just more pretty to the eye, basically. So contrapposto is a term that the Greeks, coined for this type of stance. And it's something that if you were to take more art classes, you would probably hear a lot more about. The other thing was proportions, and the Greeks liked to play with proportions quite a bit. And the average human is about, I would say actually in modern times, it's about 7.5 heads tall. And, I think that can vary by region, but I think we're getting taller as humans. And the Greeks would kind of play with that. If they wanted to do someone shown as ideal, they would increase the head height. And so Hellenistic is a later period within the Greek art history. And the Hellenistic is when they're doing these, superhuman proportions. This guy is probably 8 or 9 heads tall. I mean, look at those muscles. His muscles have muscles. And, you know, it's very dramatic. The faces are very dramatic and overly dramatic. And that was the way things were during the end of the Greek period. There was always some other stuff going on too, but this was what was in style. Interesting fact about this sculpture is it actually was found in ruins and was put back together. That's why you see there's no arm here, the hand is missing, the arm is missing here. And this one, it actually broke off and they weren't exactly sure how to reattach this. So they did what they seen. This is a biblical scene, and it's been done a whole lot of different times, and it's seen in a couple different ways. So, you know, you never know when you're putting things back together. Also, the Greeks portrayed the first nude female, and this is Aphrodite. And this, we'll talk about what Plato thought of art, and it has everything to do with this sculpture, which in today's term is really, there's, you know, not much scandal to this. But in the day, this was scandalous. It was men would spend their day staring at this sculpture and waste away their day. And so Plato found that very troubling. Then the Romans take over from the Greeks. The Romans really loved everything the Greeks did. So they didn't change a whole lot of stuff, but they, you know, made it their own. So Aphrodite became Venus. Athena became Minerva. Apollo stayed Apollo. You know, and Zeus became Jupiter. Things like that. So, but they were basically the same ideals. And the difference is they still, you know, used idealized portraiture. This is Caesar. And Caesar was a really great military man. He succeeded in a lot of places and grew the Roman lands quite a bit. But if you know the story, he got big for his head, and his Senate actually and friends ended up killing him because he just went a little crazy. And this was a portrait he had done for his wife, and it's showing him as very young, very strong, very handsome. This plate that he's wearing on his chest shows off all his military splendors. The arm out like this is an orator's pose, like he's speaking to the people because he is of the people, you know, whoops. But then he's wrapped in these, you know, leadership robes and things like that. His connection to the gods is here because Cupid is Venus's son. And so he's putting Cupid here as if he were his brother. So he's saying he is the son of Venus. He is the son of a goddess, right? And that's getting a little cuckoo. So they end up killing him. The thing that changed really is the Romans started doing portraitures. And the Greeks kind of did these ideal humans that represented everybody, you know, not a specific person. But during the Roman rule is they started to portray actual people. And they didn't shy away from age because they believed that age showed wisdom and all of those kinds of things. So their leaders would always have a bust created of them. And then other wealthy people could hire artisans to sculpt their likeness. And that was a sign of wealth and power and greatness. So if you had a bust of yourself, that meant you were somebody. And so that's a big change. You know, they still, so what really happens during the Roman time period is people are making a living and able to open up shops and commission work and try to, you know, make a living as an artist, right? And the Greeks, they did it, but I'm not sure, you know, the names, there's only a handful of famous sculptors. Now I'm going to quickly go through the other things that the Romans did for advancing civilization. And they built roads. They invented the arch and the keystone, which would allow them to build higher than any other people. They invented the aqueduct, which would bring fresh water to cities that were not close to the water. And this changed hygiene forever. And they invented cement. And so you can see the arches here and cement, so they could build taller buildings and structures that didn't weigh as much as like the marble structures. They invented baths, and the baths were a place where a lot of business took place, and there would be shops around here. There would be all kinds of things going on, and people would bathe pretty much daily, at least go to see people and all of that. They made retention walls. It's really, they advanced civilization in a lot of different ways. And then after the Roman time period, there's basically the last Roman emperor legalizes Christianity, because most of the Roman rulers were pagans. And so that impacted the whole world. And the medieval time period is ruled by the Catholic Church. Now, for these several hundred years, it's not the most creative time period for the art world or for writing or for music, because the church ruled everything. They controlled who did what and how they did it. So creativity leaves basically the world alone for 500 years. The artwork of the medieval time here is like this. It's very stagnant. It's very, there's not a lot of character to it. A lot of gold leaf was used because that meant you were connected to Jesus and heaven and holiness and all of that. And actually, the priests and other religious people would cover up any symbol of paganism. And this is where, you might know some people that are pagans even today. And there's always this kind of battle over who was doing what first, and it was the pagans. So, the one good thing that came out of the Dark Ages is they did kind of make some beautiful churches. And there are 4 things that identify a Gothic medieval church. The first is, we'll start in the top left corner, are these flying buttresses, which that is a structural element to a church that allows the building to go very high. And these are structural that are holding it up. This is actually Notre Dame. Okay, so if you see those, there could be on the interior or they could be on the exterior. The other thing is gargoyles, and there are some really kind of great gargoyles out there. Then here, the pointed arch is very Gothic, very medieval, the pointed arch. Now you see some rounded too, but if you see a pointed one, it's Gothic. And then stained glass, and really intricate stained glass. And America saw a resurgence of Gothic architecture in about the 1950s here in America. We really love it. Okay, so after the medieval time period, and it's really a social, political, economic time of rebirth, and they call it the Renaissance. It's not that the church is not in power, it just loosens its grip on the control over free thinking, right? So we're now going back. So people are getting sick of being tied down to only thinking and doing things one way, and there's going to be a revolt. There's going to, against that kind of stifled environment. And so the artists that came after the Gothic medieval time did not start from something new. They were also not inspired by the Gothic time period, so they went back to the Romans and the Greeks and took their inspiration from those artists. So a lot of times you will find, if someone's talking about classic art, that's the Romans and the Greeks. Those are what's considered like the original artists. The Renaissance are artists that look at the classical time period, but then it still has a religious context, not a mythological context, but a religious context, but also philosophically advances and kind of new way of doing things. They aren't like, you have to use gold leaf, everyone has to look the same, so it's a really kind of exciting time period. Donatello was a sculptor. This is his version of David versus Goliath. Very different than Michelangelo's version. Very different. Raphael did a lot of frescoes, and this is in the Vatican. We've got Plato and Aristotle here, and then all other kinds of theologians, mathematicians, and this is kind of about education and philosophy and the idea of thinking for yourself. It's really kind of awesome. So the Renaissance, it's about rebirth of ideas, processes, thinking, art. And there were still being paid by, the church, but they were also getting commissions as well. And this is probably one of the most famous sculptures ever. It was done, it's called the Pietà, which means sorrow, pity, those kinds of adjectives. It was done by Michelangelo when Michelangelo was just about 20 years old. And it's a commissioned piece. I think it was a cardinal. It was either cardinal or a bishop who wanted a new, most beautiful sculpture to go on top of his grave. He was going to be buried in the Vatican, and so he wanted this remarkable sculpture to go on top of his tomb. And Michelangelo was like, "Yeah, I can do that for you." And it took him 2 years, and this is what he sculpted. This sculpture is at 20 years old, you guys. That's just mind-blowing. But it's so good. Let's look at it really detailed. Now, this story here, this is the Virgin Mary holding Jesus after he's been taken down from the cross. This is not a story that comes from the Bible. And actually, there were a lot of stories in Europe about this that weren't in the Bible. I'm not sure the other story, what they were called, but so it was kind of a familiar story. And look how she's holding him. The Virgin Mary looks very young, right? Now let's talk about proportions. Let's look at her head and then look at her shoulders. They're getting a little wide. Then look at her legs. Look how large. Now they're covered with cloth. Michelangelo is for sure trying to kind of hide the fact that he had to mess with the proportions to actually show her holding her grown son in her lap, because physically this composition would not happen if it was, her real size. So he had to fudge with that a little bit. And honestly, it's the type of thing that art historians would notice or artists would notice, and the lay person wouldn't, really care about that. But there is some play on the proportions. What I love about this is the detail and how this is marble. Marble is a very hard stone. And if you look here where her hand, which looks mammoth here, is pushing up on the underarm, and it's making it look like flesh, right? It's acting like flesh. I also think of the rib cage and the muscles here, the muscles and tones that we see, and in the ankle. Look at that. I mean, it's just so realistic, and he's so young. He's so young. This is one of the only sculptures Michelangelo ever signed, and it's kind of a cross here on the Virgin Mary. It's like a sash or something. It's also one giant piece of marble that he carved into. It's just absolutely beautiful. And you can see on her face, and it looks like she is wearing a mourning veil, very thin veil there, and you can get a better look. So there was a lot of, okay, so one thing that happened, as soon as this was done, Michelangelo becomes famous. He becomes well known at his skill and mastery of sculpture. I mean, because look at this, right? It's crazy. So he, at a young age, proves himself and then just goes on to do remarkable, amazing things. And yeah, the sculpture becomes more famous than the cardinal or bishop. I'm sorry, I can't remember that right now, who had it commissioned. So they remove it from his tomb and they put it in another place, St. Peter's Basilica, I think. Yeah, I'm pretty sure. It's in St. Peter's Basilica in the Vatican. So more people can come see it and more people can enjoy it. It's just an amazing piece. Again, it's called the Pietà by Michelangelo, Virgin Mary holding Jesus across her lap. There's his signature. And then look at the face. I mean, it's just gorgeous. Just really, really highly skilled. So he proves himself as a young man and then goes on to leave a wonderful life. Here is his David. I can't remember if I've shown this before. And it's very different than Donatello's David. This David is very masculine, very strong. And if you guys know the story of David and Goliath, I actually kind of visualize David more in the Donatello version because I think, he's supposed to be this young boy who goes out and defeats this monster, right? And so, here this guy looks pretty tough. And the other one, he looked younger, he looked a little bit feminine even. But this is a beautiful sculpture, that's for sure. Michelangelo also does the Sistine Chapel. He's older when he does this. It takes him about 4 years with help. He does have help to do this. And, one of the misnomers is he actually doesn't ever lay on his back to paint this. He's standing up most of the time to do this. So another Renaissance artist is Leonardo da Vinci. So if you recognize these names, we've got Donatello, Raphael, Michelangelo, and Leonardo. What does that remind you of? It's a great way to remember the major Renaissance artists. Now there are a ton more that I'm skipping over, but yes, it's the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. And Da Vinci, you have a video to watch. I can't remember if it's on Da Vinci or Michelangelo. I think it's Da Vinci, and it's really interesting. And famously, he painted the most recognizable painting in the world, the Mona Lisa. And the Mona Lisa is famous for a lot of different reasons. But let me ask you this question before we move on. Do you like this painting? Would you, if you could, would you purchase it and hang it in your house? I mean, do you like it that much? Do you want to see it every day? Or are we socially conditioned to like this painting? I think we're more the latter. I mean, it's interesting, but I don't know that I necessarily want to have it in my house. It's not really my style, but of course it's actually, we don't know what it's worth. So let's talk about why it's so famous and why it's so important. Even if we don't like it, we need to appreciate it. Okay, so here's the thing. This is the first time somebody is painted from like the waist up. Most other paintings of people were either a bust, kind of from the chest up, or a full body. They hadn't cropped anybody like this. Da Vinci was the first to do that. That's a big deal. That's a big deal. Also, there was a mystery pretty quickly in the history of this painting of who this person was. And there were all kinds of suspicions. A lot of people thought it was Da Vinci's mother. Then when Freud was popular and his theories were popular, they thought it was Da Vinci's mother. They thought it was, all these different lovers, students, all these different people. And they found out that it actually was commissioned by a businessman of his wife. But Da Vinci was not happy with it. He never actually gave it to the businessman. He actually ends up taking it with him when he moves to France. So, we don't know if he worked on it more later, because that's why the date on here stretches such a long time, because we know kind of when he started it, where the paint dates back to, but we don't know. We don't know if he worked on it for these, 14 years or what he did, but we know he didn't sell it. The Mona Lisa is also famous because it's been stolen and attacked many times. So that adds to its prestige. It is now behind bulletproof glass, and you cannot get within 6 feet of it because of how valuable it is and how much damage has already been done to it. So if you're lucky to get close to it, like this, the museum must not be open, because usually it's like 4 to 10 people deep and you can't get close to it. I was really lucky that, because I'm so old, I was able to see it before it was behind the glass. Yeah. So other things that made it famous is that she's wearing a mourning veil. Can you see this light line here? And it was not common for people to have their portraits done while they were in mourning. So that's unusual. The other thing was the smile, the Mona Lisa smile. Is she happy? Is she sad? Does she know something that somebody else doesn't know? Right? So the expression was very vague and obtuse. So that drew a lot of, questions and mystery around it. Also, the space. If you look here, we're looking at the background, and it's so different and unique and unexpected and possibly incomplete from anything else that Da Vinci has done. And so that, again, that adds to the mystery of it. This is actually oil paint on poplar. And so it has had some issues with it. They have cleaned it, and people think that her eyebrows are gone because they cleaned it too much. I can still see a little bit of the eyebrow, but I don't know if that was a fashion for that time period. What? And so also the horizon is different in here. It's low on one side, high on the other, where you see water back in the distance. It's just a little bit kind of strange. Now, also, there is an underpainting. Well, let me back up. Oftentimes, artists will paint over a canvas, so the underpainting is not that unusual. And most artists, well, not most, Da Vinci for sure always painted 2 canvases of the same subject. They weren't exactly the same, but they were very, very close. This one on the right was found, and it was thought to have been a Da Vinci, but it turns out it was a student's work. So when he's working, there would be someone literally right next to him painting the exact same thing. But when you look at it, you can see the angle of the neck is different, the chin is different, the use of the paint is different, the hands, all this, lots of differences. But they both kind of have this wacky backdrop. This is the underpainting that they revealed. And oh, I should tell you one other thing. Do you guys see this here? Is she sitting on a patio or a balcony of some kind? This is also the first time something like that has been done. People thought at first this might have been a painted backdrop or another painting or something, but we believe that she's sitting on a deck or, you know, a covered patio. This is the Isleworth Mona Lisa. This is the other Da Vinci Mona Lisa. And they've done a lot of tests on it. Again, the neck is a little bit different, but the scale of the face and features is very much Da Vinci's style. And so they've tested it and discovered that it is real. Okay, so after the Renaissance, where the ideas are new and they're expressing themselves in new ways, comes the Baroque period. Baroque. And in their work, there's a sense of grandeur, right? So overly dramatic, kind of like the Hellenistic time period during the Greek movement. It was overly emotional, really hyped up on the drama, exaggerated motion, and often violent, physically, sexually, all of that. It was something, really. And the subject matter didn't necessarily always be religious. It could be native stories. It could be mythological again, all different kinds of things. Now, this one is a biblical story, and he talks about, Holofernes talks about killing people of a town, and Judith beheads him before he can. Judith and her maid behead him. So you can see this is like, you know, exaggerated blood spatter, very, what was his name? Quentin Tarantino, kind of the blood for the scare factor. But look at the expression on the face, right? Really, like he's looking at death. He's surprised, you know, and the women are a little upset but determined. The maid looks pissed, right? I mean, look at that. Beautifully painted and just raw emotion. And you know, I don't know what it would look like if you behead somebody, but you know, I would imagine that the blood would be not just shooting out, but just kind of all over the place. Here's a Medusa. And again, the blood spatter, really dramatic. This is Caravaggio, who was really an interesting character. He was very, very interesting, kind of radical. And so this is taking Jesus down, burying him. This is the beheading of St. John the Baptist. So, right, they're gruesome. They're dramatic. They're like little soap opera kind of things. Here's a David and Goliath, another one. See the boy here, this is kind of how I picture him. Younger. And look at that detail in Goliath's face, right? He really looks dead. Okay, so, and also I should say about the Baroque time period, the paintings were very large, really large. So Romanticism is an emphasis on emotional. Now, we're not talking about necessarily romantic stories, although a lot of Shakespeare was interpreted during this time and other literature and things like that. But it was more about an escape from reality. Imagination was used. There's a lot of natural themes, and again, like I said, allegorical subjects. So the subject matter often came from writing. J.M.W. Turner was one of a brilliant romantic painter, and he loved weather and the water, and he liked to paint Mother Nature's effect on water and all of that. So we see that subject matter over and over again in his paintings. Here's another, a storm coming, brewing, right? And the water's churning up. Very interesting happenings. And they varied from, kind of more clear, more atmospheric qualities. These are all the same artist, right? And here, this is, look at, it's showing, what's going on down at the shipyard. So the subject matter was very kind of real. And showing human personalities and stuff. But he did love the landscape and showing the atmosphere. A storm, right? A shipwreck. People are pulling themselves out of the water. And really, he gained an appreciation for the beauty of nature. I love this. And this is, this is kind of teetering on abstract art. And although, I don't know that other people would say that, but it's looking, it's looking like it's not a definite painting. Now this is different. You can see, this is Paris. You can see Notre Dame in the back, and then this is burning, right? It's along the Seine, and there's people watching it burn. So I'm not sure what it is. I don't think it's Notre Dame, but here's another shipwreck. And you can see bodies, and this child is in the water, right? And just not much is going on. This person is holding on to the mast. It's a dangerous thing. This one's in a snowstorm. Now this, I would argue, this is an abstraction for sure. So yeah, it's hard to see. Okay, so then we are now into the time of modernism. This is kind of comes apart around 1850. And you think about the history of what's going on in the world, and it's really the Industrial Revolution changes everything, right? So it breaks from the classical things. The ideas are changing a lot. A lot of things are happening in the world, and that affects, social things. People start rethinking things. Philosophical ideas evolve. Art evolves. I mean, it sometimes takes a big event to make a big change. So some of the this era is basically, characterized by industrialization, rapid social changes, and advances in science and social science. Some of the thinkers are Freud, Sigmund Freud. James Joyce writes Ulysses during this time period. This is the time period of Virginia Woolf and her writings. And this is also, for artists, there's a lot of experimentation going on, right? And then one thing that happens, this is kind of when we're into the isms, what we call in the art world, realism, cubism, all of that stuff. So realism is kind of exactly what it sounds like. It's artists who depict life and things as they were, without embellishment or interpretation. The subject matter is fairly commonplace. They show everyday people. And so Thomas Eakins was one of those realists. He was a very interesting person because he kind of dabbled in a whole bunch of different things. He was interested in photography, which was being invented, and of course painting. And he really enjoyed painting athletic bodies and the human form. And so these are some studies that he's done, right? And he would sketch at an actual boxing event, but then go to his studio to paint it. And so he would have to, make sketches and then enhance it and try to memorize the form. This is one of his more famous pieces. It's the swimming hole. And again, he's very interested in the form. He also was interested in the advancement in medicine. And this is called the Gross Clinic. It's a very famous painting. And basically, it's Dr. Gross, who is teaching the medical students, who I hope you can see them up here, how to save a man's leg. Before this, it would have had to been cut off, right? Amputated. But Dr. Gross is saying, no, we can do things and save the man's leg. And so he's cutting into it, you notice, without a mask, without a guard, without gloves. He's wearing, business suit. All of them are. And, here's the wife kind of turning away in horror. And there's, the medical students watching, taking notes, if they're good students, right? So, they're working on the femur bone in this. And so he's showing advancement. He's very interested in that and showing us how the doctors learn. Several years later, he paints this one. This is called the Agnew Clinic. And this is also very controversial because now they're wearing garb. Doesn't look like they have gloves on yet, but at least they're protecting their clothes. This is a woman and she's having a mastectomy. And so by the time this is painted, the Victorian era is in full swing, which is changing social status. Before the Victorian period, everybody worked in the house. And then when the social things changes, then women of the house did not work. They hired people. And there's a shift in class systems happens during this time period. So it was very scandalous. Oh my God, a woman's breasts. And there's all those men gawking, right? And people didn't understand that it's science and they're trying to save the woman's life. And I think it's very interesting. The men some of them seem very interested and some of them seem like they're taking a nap in here. During this time period, it's now we're kind of into the late 1800s. Even the turn of the century. And there's a part of France called Montmartre. And Montmartre is high up on a hill. There's this beautiful church. And it's just over, where's my cursor? Here we go. It's just kind of over this side, on the back side of this hill, where the area of Montmartre attracted so many artists. The rent was cheap, so artists lived there. It was also where a lot of nightclubs were. If you've seen Moulin Rouge, this is the area we're talking about because the Moulin Rouge is there. There was cafes and studios and all the artists and writers and all creatives in France at the time, or even in the world, would gather in Montmartre, and they would drink absinthe and drink and party late into the night and have wonderful discussions and then go back and work in their studio until they passed out and woke up and did the whole thing again. It was a really kind of interesting time period. And it brought people from all different ages and ranges. We've got Spencer Tracy, Scott Fitzgerald, Hemingway. This is another person I can't think. But this is what they would do. They would drink into the night. They would talk. They were philosophical. It was really kind of a wonderful, wonderful time period. And they called it the green hour, when they would all drink absinthe. And real absinthe would cause hallucinations. And that inspired a lot of different movements. And one of them being the surreal movement. The other thing that's going on at this time is Impressionism. And the one thing about Impressionists was that it's the first time that art is taken outdoors. And that's pretty freaking amazing. Everyone had been painting in their studio, and now the artists are saying, no, I need to see the light and the color that the light is casting to get a feeling for what I'm trying to express. So the most well-known Impressionist painter is Claude Monet, and he had a very distinct style. Broad, thick brushstrokes, very soft, not a lot of detail. And they took the term of Impressionism from a critic who went to see a show, and he said, these aren't paintings, these are just impressions of paintings. And they're like, that's exactly what we're trying to do. So they thought, it was a Barb kind of review of their show, but they turned it into their advantage. Beautiful, beautiful paintings. And he had a very long career, and he was part of the Montmartre. He lived in Giverny, France, which is outside of Paris, and had beautiful gardens and was pretty well established artist, but he would go into Paris and meet up with other artists as well. In the last 30 years of his life, he painted 250 water lilies. And just to give you an idea, nowadays, his water lilies go from anywhere between like around $20 million. So imagine there are 250 paintings of water lilies. Depending on scale and point of completion could vary that price. So he would oftentimes paint the same subject, but at different times of day. Look at these beautiful colors, right? They're just really beautiful. And then, morning versus sunset. And it's still a haystack, but he's looking at it differently. And he's outside. It's amazing. He did portraits. He did, kind of a little bit of everything. But the way he applied the paint is very specific and lacks detail, and his globs of paint. Heavy-handed. I think I've shown you this one before. Love it. Here's one of his garden. And, excuse me, his home is actually open. You can go into his home and I didn't go into the house. I just walked around the gardens. And they were, absolutely beautiful. Just lovely. Lovely. And the thing about Monet that a lot of people like, and it's one of the things I like about it too, they're just really beautiful. They're really pretty paintings. And you don't have to think a lot about them. You can just be like, oh, it's a Monet. And Monet is very highly collected. A lot of people start out their collections with a Monet. And I would probably bet that most people who own art, are serious collectors with a lot of money have a Monet. Here he is. This is a photograph of him. Is he what you pictured? With his long beard and his great outfit amongst his garden. Really beautiful. So after the Impressionists, and the Impressionist movement actually wasn't popular, but for about 20 years. It started about 1880 and went to the 1900s. But Monet, Manet, and some other ones continued painting in that manner. The younger started with Impressionists, but then they evolved. They took a lot from Impressionism, but they worked outdoors and they were very interested in color and light. But they wanted a little bit more emotion. And they also they didn't want to just do blobs of paint. They wanted to kind of work with that idea a little bit more. And so they added more symbolism to their work, and they tended to abstract their color relationships a little bit more, which means they would put colors in weird places. And Vincent van Gogh is the most famous post-impressionist artist, I would argue. Now, we talked about this Starry Night before that was painted when he was trying to show swirls of paint. And This is, by far a very, very famous painting. He tried to copy the Impressionist style, but he was unsuccessful, and this is kind of what he ended up with. And this became his style, these short kind of lines that he would put one after another and kind of layer on top of each other. So we're not looking at dots or smudges or things like that. These are distinct marks that he's making. They're kind of short, they're kind of fat, and just kind of one after another in a rhythmic kind of way. And he said, that he was rejecting the observed world and trying to put his emotions and feelings more into the paintings. And I could argue that he was very successful during that. He was not a successful artist while he was alive. He only ever sold one painting when he was alive. I think I have it in here. This is a painting of his therapist. He voluntarily committed himself several times throughout his young, short life. He did struggle quite a bit his whole life. He was he was socially awkward. And his family, he didn't really fit into his family. The only family member that really understood him was his younger brother, Theo. And it was through Theo and their friendship that really made Vincent who he was. So this is actually while he was in an asylum. This is a painting of his doctor. So Vincent tried many different careers as a young man. His family owned a gallery, but he was kind of awkward and he couldn't sell anything and he kind of put people off. And he thought about becoming a priest, but he loved women too much and he didn't like the idea of being celibate, so that went away. And it was his brother Theo who said, maybe you should try your hand at art. And thank God Theo did that, because Vincent became one of the most amazing artists in the history of art. Now you have to think about this. He had mental issues. He definitely had bipolar disorder. He was an acute alcoholic. He was a drug user for sure. And he hid his mental illness with alcohol and drugs. He was often suicidal. They say he hallucinated, and we don't know if that's alcoholic hallucinations or drug or mental. It could have been all three at once. And all of that, he also had a paralyzing anxiety disorder. And he drank daily to the blackout point, and we believe that he had syphilis. That's not actually how he died. He didn't die of any of that. He actually died of a gunshot wound to his abdomen while he was out one day in the middle of the day. That's very suspicious, because if you're going to kill yourself, I don't think you shoot yourself in the gut. But, there's all kinds of story. He ended up succumbing to that wound. And even though he had all of these disorders, he still managed to paint some amazing work. And I think, people remember him for that tragic story of his life, right? But think about what came out of that life and what he was, no matter what, he was still able to paint and make incredible things, right? And that's amazing to me. We hear a lot of people today having various anxiety disorders and depression and all of that. And it's wonderful when they can get through things and make things. We can't discount that. He did famously cut off his ear. And unfortunately, his life is so sad. He fell in love often. But it was mostly unrequited. Is that the word? Unrequited love. They didn't love him back. And so he was distraught and upset. And so he cut off his ear and sent it to one of his women. They were mostly prostitutes, because he would pay for sex. And, it was very disturbing that this happened. And his friend, he did have some good friends, and they were worried about him. His brother was worried about him, and then he would check into the hospital and be well, But it's very, very sad, sad life, but accomplished. Let's not forget that. Let's not forget how accomplished he is. This is the bar that he went to regularly and regularly passed out at. His brother would send him money, and then he would buy paint and drink all the money. He wouldn't buy food. But he would get fed when he was in the hospital. This is in the hospital. And then he would have really good days. Remember what we talked about when we talked about color theory? If you go back and look through some artwork of artists that have disorders, you should pay attention to their colors. It's not on accident. So this is a very good day here. I really like his orchards and his olive, orchard and things like that, in the fields. Like these are some of my favorite of his work. The brush strokes are changing a little bit. They're not so separated in all these places. Yeah. Look at this. Again, look at the wind he's trying to portray. Just love it. And there's so much texture to his paintings. And he was, like I had said before, he really is a colorist. He's very interested in the color. Okay. We've got a couple more movements, and then we're going to be done with this. So I'll try to speed this up. Expressionism is basically all about feelings. They're trying to express their inner feelings in a visual form. Okay, so it's all about expressing emotion. So think about expressing emotion, expressionism. Okay, it's not interested in reality. They're not interested in proportions and all of that. They're in for, they want to move you through color and symbols. And Edvard Munch is, probably the best known expressionist painting. There were a lot of them, painter rather. There are a lot of them. And let's see what's going on here in this painting. We have a woman. She's got a red face. Is that passion or violence? Then we've got a green face on who we think is a portrait of Edvard, kind of looks like him. And then a yellow face on what looks like a little bit more of a handsome, taller man. So are we dealing with jeopardy here? What are we dealing with? Then he painted the very, very famous painting, The Scream. And let me just give you the backstory on this. Edvard and his sister grew up under a very strict religious fundamentalist father, a controlling man who put his children down every chance he got. And eventually the sister couldn't take it anymore, and she had to be taken to a mental institution. And Edvard had done that I don't know, I can't remember if this is him dropping him off or going for a visit with a few friends of the family or cousins or something like that. And as he's leaving his sister, he's having this kind of inner turmoil, and he's screaming. He originally named it The Nature of the Scream, and then we've just shortened it to The Scream. But this is his emotions coming through, this frustration, this sadness, this anxiety, and this sorrow for what is happening to his sister because of his father, and he still has to deal with it, and he's just had it. And so the anguish is distorting his face. This is one of the paintings. He actually made 4 versions and a lithograph of the same thing. He uses different material on different surfaces, on different substrates, and each one is a little bit different, but the consistents are that he's walking along some kind of path. Looks kind of like a bridge because it looks like it goes over water, and there's water in each one. The two men are behind him. In the three of them, there's people in boats, and there's some crazy colors going on. But in all of them, the face, the head is distorted, right, to try to express it. And he's doing this over and over in order for him to process this. Here's the lithograph. Now, don't think that the movie, the Scream franchise movies, definitely took the mask from this painting. Okay, that's definitely a thing. The work he did continued to be very emotional and somber. You know, people sick in bed, people wanting lustful kind of paintings. The heartbreak, right? His wet red hand is over his heart, and the bride is kind of floating away from him. This is the death of a family member. And his family members, you know, are like green with sickness. And maybe it's the tyrannical religious kind of sickness. And the light colors are over the death, the dead. So there's hope there. And there's all this darkness on this side. This is interesting to analyze, I think, you know, with the voluptuous woman who's like sucking the life out of this man, you know, very interesting, very strange. And I'm not sure, you know, I think these are supposed to mean babies. Often students will say they look like aliens. You know, I don't disagree, but, you know, I'm not sure. How do you interpret this? Man in love with a mermaid. Again, it's this love that's almost detrimental or unattainable that he portrays. It's how he feels about, you know, his love life or his want for someone to love him. Okay, Cubism. I should say that Expressionism kind of starts at the, you know, a little bit before the turn of the century, and then Cubism starts in 1910. So, you know, this is all, you know, Impressionist, Post-Impressionist, um, Expressionism, all is at kind of at the same time. And then Cubist is invented literally in 1910. And they basically reject realism and nature, and they start to emphasize showing multiple surfaces at once. And they reduce object to geometric forms. And then they use multiple vantage points at one time. And one of the inventors of Cubism is Pablo Picasso. He didn't necessarily, his first painting wasn't Cubist, but he gets there and he lives there. And he does so much Cubist work that he's kind of synonymous with the movement. And you can see in this painting over here, you know, the human, this is a human. It's hard to tell. I'm pretty sure this is a woman, but I think this is a woman. Here, her breasts, her butt. No, I can't really make out the head. I think that might be the head. Here are other breasts, another woman, and her bottom, and she's posing with her leg up on another leg. Here's a woman with, at least she has a head here. Her breast, her belly button, and her hands, but then her feet are kind of missing. Picasso, very, very kind of interesting. Definitely a master of art. I mean, he's definitely a genius. There's no arguing that. These are some of his early work. You can see they're more figurative. They look like actual humans. He lost someone that he was very close to in his life as a young man, and that started his blue period. So these are heavily used with blue paint to show emotion, depression, and things like that. And then famously, he painted this in 1907. And you can start to see the Cubism begin. right? There, if you think about this leg, um, here, it's no longer really looking like a leg. It's made up of triangles and odd shapes. And you see that in the breasts, you see that in these arms, in the nose, and certainly here. This is showing he had gone to a art exhibit of African masks, and so he puts them on the faces. This is called La Demoiselle d'Avignon. They are prostitutes at a brothel that he regularly attended and went to. And so, yeah, this is the ladies are waiting for the men to purchase them. And it was his first big splash onto the art scene, this painting. And then from there he went into the more cubist style, like this, a woman with a mandolin or guitar. I think that's a mandolin. I'm not superly sure. But it's showing, the front of the guitar, the side of the guitar, the back of the guitar, all of it at once. And that's the flattening out of space. This is a very important piece, and we'll talk about this more in the social and political. But Spain actually, the country, commissioned him to paint this to commemorate a bombing of a small town. It's called Guernica, and that was the name of the town that was bombed. And again, it's in this kind of distorted cubist fashion that he paints. And, it changes throughout his time period, but this exaggerated, strange view continues throughout his life. And Picasso was not necessarily the nicest man ever. He cheated on his wife all the time. He's famously quoting that women are good for two things. It's like they are two things. They're either princesses or doormats. And, that's not very kind to say, but women were drawn to him. He was very successful during his life and famous from a young time period well into his age. He was very sexual, and all women wanted to be with him. And he was with a lot of women. Then he would portray, when he fell out of love with them, he would really portray them as really ugly and vicious and scary and tortured. This woman is crying, but she's green, she looks ill, her hands are kind of distorted, right? But this person he's portraying, he admires. And he would paint from real people. Not always, but sometimes. It's just amazing. Okay, the Dada movement. The Dada movement is right after World War I. And it's basically World War I, the men who fought in World War I were sickened by themselves, by the countries that allowed them to do this to other men. And there was a movement that rejected basically the people, the lifestyle, the type of people that would allow wars like that to go on. And it's a very irreverent, almost chaotic, almost, just whatever went was okay. So it was termed artistic anarchy. They wanted to buck the system in a way that made people talk about it. And Marcel Duchamp, and I showed you this one before, Nude Descending a Staircase. This is very cubist in style. So he was doing other stuff and then experienced World War I and then changed him. And you can kind of see, can you guys see the similarities of the movement of the person walking? Maybe hopefully this helps you see it better. But he would put random things together, random relationships. And then this piece one time got damaged as it got shipped to a new gallery, and he was not upset. He was like, finally, it's finished. This accident needed to happen, and it's perfect. And so, and most artists would be like, y'all are paying for this, and I don't know, get really pissed. But he liked that randomness that would happen. It was part of his vocabulary. He embraced it. He famously purchased a urinal at a hardware store and painted or signed R. Mutt 1917 on the urinal and put it on display. This pissed off a lot of people because it's a urinal, it's indecent. But for the art world, what he's doing is, yeah, he's trying to shock us, for sure. He's trying to get us to think. But what he's saying and what he's doing is he's saying, you know what? Anything can be art. Art is what I say it is. And right now, I'm saying art is this urinal. This is blowing the artists and philosophers and the art historians and the people. They're like, wait, what? Artists are totally behind this. They're like, yeah, go. You're doing absolutely. The younger artists are, at least. We can buck the system. This is ridiculous. Yes, I agree. Anything can be art. And Duchamp really builds a name for himself for doing these outrageous things. And he becomes immediately famous. And it starts this ready-made concept where he would just buy things and put them together and call it art. A wheel on top of a stool. This holds bottles, a bottle rack. And he would just put it in a gallery. And he says it's art because I say it's art. And why not? Tell me why it's not art. Right? It's got shape, it's got movement, it's got texture, it's got scale. Here he glued nails or welded nails to an iron. Why not? He's creating a whole nother vocabulary in art. This is genius stuff here. This is what I'm saying, like genius. Da Vinci did the same thing. To mention Da Vinci, Duchamp also would take a postcard, add some word, take the same postcard or a different postcard, add a mustache and a goatee. And, again, he's changing it. He's questioning, is this art? I think it's art. What do you think? And even just making a making a story, getting people talking is great for art. Getting people thinking is great for art. And Marcel Duchamp was a real master at that. Okay, so surrealism is is going on, all during this time, but kind of really takes off in the 1920s-ish. And it's basically, they're trying to visualize their imagination and the imagination of their subconscious. And they're really fans of Sigmund Freud. Sigmund Freud believed in free association, dream analysis, and tapping into the subconscious. And there would be different things in order to get into that. If you were a patient of Sigmund Freud, a lot of artists just did a lot of drugs, to be honest with you. And they would, really try to think of just unrelated objects. And let me ask you this. Do you guys remember your dreams and how disjointed they could be, where one minute you're doing one thing and another minute you're doing something else? They would paint that. They would try to work that into some ideas. And they also were interested in the ideas of Karl Marx, the surrealists were. The psyche that has the power to reveal contradictions in everyday world. Whoops. Oh, I guess I start with surrealism in the next section. Okay, there is a discussion board assignment, so make sure you do that. And thank you for your patience on this half of our history.